Let's welcome our guest now, David Orenstein, if you would come up here, please, to give your speech on Charles Darwin.
Hi, can you hear me now? Okay, beautiful. Can you hear me now? Moon River, wider sea. So I'm going to present this as best I can as sort of like a TED Talk. TED Talk. You can tell I'm from Brooklyn. I'm sorry. TED Talk. But just a fair warning, most of the material from the presentation comes from this new book that I've written with my co-author, Abby Hafer, who's a wonderful biologist. She's up in Boston. And so I'm doing something similar to this for American Atheists in April. So you are, in a sense, seeing the first iteration of the talk. But I think it's really important, and I wanted to make sure that this chapter made it into the book because, you know, from the beginning of time, you know, something from nothing or something from everything, depending on your perspective, when humans evolved, we evolved this intense curiosity about the world. We were able to make tools, we were able to, in a sense, own the planet in ways that no other species really can, for better or worse. I think we're seeing now maybe for worse in terms of climate science and things like that. But because we're able to use our reasoned faculties, we've been able to dethrone other forms of knowledge. Knowledge that was incomplete, that was just wrong, and for which, through science, we have much better ideas and ways of knowing the world, that is, the material universe. And we can thank not only so many scientists who come before, but certainly Charles Darwin as well, because of his formational work at the time that he published The Origin of Species and then later The Descent of Man. By the way, he published multiple books on everything from the expressions of animals to how fast vines grow and everything. He was really a really fascinating man. But we owe Charles Darwin both in terms of our understanding of the natural world, but also our understanding of what we've come to understand as the free thought, the free thinking world, the humanist perspective, the non-belief perspective. We've entrusted, others have entrusted in him because of his rock-solid knowledge, our ability to now know even more and to be able to explain things more in a natural and foundational way, which brings us, I think, all closer together. So let me see if I can make this work. Come on. There we go. So there's worldwide acknowledgement about Darwin and his work. In fact, if you look at surveys that are done both among scientists and lay people, you find that natural selection's among some of like the top things, like everything from the concept of zero to our place in the universe, and germ theory, the discoveries or uncoveries of RNA and DNA. So he's really, really, the idea of evolution, or in particular natural selection, is incredibly important for everything else that we know about the world. And if you look at, and I know this is a popularity contest, where Charles Darwin sits in terms of times 100 most important people, you find that he's coming in at like number 12. You know, everyone remember Casey Kasem, America's Top 40? Coming in at number 12, Charles Robert Darwin. But, and this is the interesting thing, is, and I like to do as a free thinker and as a humanist myself, is to actually sort of take away the religious and the fascists and the conquerors, and if you do that subtraction, you find that he comes in at like number 6. So 6 with a bullet, as I like to say, you know. So that's really, really important because you see that, you know, he's more important to our lives, whether you're religious or not, than people really almost give him credit for. You know, Darwin had a really hard time in 1859 for a lot of reasons. If you look back at the history, Victorian England was steeped in mysticism. People were doing seances and reading tea leaves, and there really was a real need for the occult more than there was a need for it was almost a reaction to 400 years of rationalist perspective giving us so many different things that there was this backlash. Hence 2016. Okay, you find that, you know, if history doesn't repeat itself, it certainly looks an awful lot like itself in many, many different venues. And that was certainly happening when Darwin published in 1859. Here's a man who's saying basically, and he never talked, if you ever read Origin of Species, never talked about human evolution. He just talked about natural selection and how species adapt, speciate, or become extinct, saying that there's a material factor related to all of these things, and that immediately supersedes anything related to the occult. So there was pushback from Victorian England from that sense. There was also pushback from the minds of other powerful intellectuals who were religious. You also had the Church of England and the Vatican, who were obviously not fans, right? So, you know, at the same time that the Church of England and the Vatican were fighting against the occult and the mystics of the 19th century, they were now having to fight the second war on Darwin, saying that, no, you're both wrong, and that the material universe is really what matters, and that natural selection matters, and that we are organic beings and we all respond based on these natural laws. And so the monarchy and social elites saw what Darwin was basically saying as really profoundly against the status quo. You know, if I'm better than you because I'm white, well, of course I can own India or China or have slaves, right? If everybody's equal, right, then, and everyone is susceptible to the same things, there is no such thing as a better group of people. And so that itself was very, very profound at the time in the mid-19th century. And Darwin himself really didn't do much after he published to defend himself. Darwin was not a public speaker. Darwin had lots of fears. Darwin had illnesses. Some of them might have been psychosomatic. Some of them were related to confrontation. He never really wanted to confront. He wanted to publish. And if you ever go to the Darwin Correspondence Project, you find that this guy is sort of not only the apical ancestor to the Freethought Movement and the biology movement, but also a lot of philosophers were writing to him. You know, this was a great age where people were penning letters, and the depth and the breadth of who he was contacting in his private life, in his study at Down House in Kent, and who was commiserating with him is just fascinating. But he never publicly spoke out. He just wrote. He lost his daughter, Annie, who was age 9, and that was one of the things that I think pushed him over the edge towards non-belief. You know, Darwin did not have a degree in biology. Darwin did not have a degree in medicine, although he went to school to become a doctor. Couldn't stand the sight of blood. So what do you do if you're the son of a doctor and you're part of the English gentry? You're not part of the aristocracy, but you're wealthy. Well, you get a degree in clergy. Yeah, so Darwin had a degree in divinity. Yeah, when he graduated, he didn't graduate with a degree in science, yet his profound work has impacted the scientific world in more dimensions than you could ever imagine. So again, he was a writer and he was a collaborator, but he was not a public speaker. Theodore Brinski, I believe, is a Polish biologist who essentially said that nothing in the natural world, especially in biology, makes sense except in the light of evolution. That is, no other theory explains things better than evolution and natural selection. So if there are any Michael Behe fans in the audience, you know who he is, intelligent design. Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
His son works for us.
Oh, does he really?
Yes, and he's an atheist.
Bravo. Must make Michael very, very happy to have a son as an atheist. But, you know, this is along the same line as Carl Sagan saying, you know, the universe, that we exist so the universe can know itself. The idea is not that there's a consciousness to the universe, but that we have been able to develop our frontal cortex, right? Our ability to speak, to reason, to listen, to have empathy, all of those things. I know you're having a program on empathy soon, okay? Simply because we could use the tools of science to now understand the thing that really brought us into existence in the first place. That is in itself profound. It's like what, who is it, Neil deGrasse Tyson said was that, you know, we are all connected. Do you know this? We're connected to each other biologically. We're connected to the earth chemically, and we're connected to the universe atomically. So we could check off all of those boxes. And that's also essentially what natural selection basically says, is that it profoundly puts all of nature, of which humans are part of, into that same box. And so when we look at natural selection here, and without even touching on free thought yet, we see that it's affected so many other of the sciences. That is itself foundational to understanding and being reasonable, being able to study everything from pharmacology to genomics to even things like, on the softer side, religious studies, or my area, anthropology. So Darwin is not only the apical ancestor to the Freethought movement, but to the understanding of the material universe movement. We owe that to natural selection. From the book, these are the Darwin's Apostles. And I always like to use the word, words that are typically religious in nature and turn them on their heads, because actually if you look at what the words really meant when they first were invented, they actually were secular, and that they were captured by religion. But apostle, if you look at the original dictionary definition of it, it's just someone who's on a quest, you know, to be able to share information. Same thing like in my earlier book, Godless Grace, the whole idea of grace, which is related to graciousness. You know, sometimes we only think about it in terms of religious, you know, saying grace, things like that. But these words, which are powerful because words have meaning, were not always owned by the religious class. They were secular in their invention. But these are the men who really did actually speak out for Darwin when Darwin could not speak for himself. Draper, who was a first president of the Chemical Society, he was English. He came to the United States in, I think, the 1830s. He actually, you all know about the Great Debate in 1860 that took place between this guy right here, Huxley, and Wilberforce. The whole idea of is, you know, a year after Origin is published, there was this great debate in the halls of British intellectual organizations, and three of the people who speak out in favor of Darwin are T.H. Huxley, John W. Draper, and Joseph Hooker. Hooker being one of Darwin's earliest friends, who was he's a botanist and was the curator of the Royal Gardens at Kew, taking over for his father. But Americans like Asa Gray, who was religious and tried to actually thread the needle of we can have religion and science. Gray actually secured what was then the earliest forms of copyright for Charles Darwin's work in the United States. Because after Darwin published in 1859, first of all, it sold out immediately, and there were immediate multiple copies. But then publishers, because there wasn't this copyright, the way we know copyright now, people were actually republishing his work. I wouldn't say illegally because there was no legal basis for it, but they were just republishing his work. And what Asa Gray was able to do, aside from being a good friend and defender of Darwin, was to able to get what was then as close as possible to the idea of owning, that is the information, owning it, so that Darwin would receive royalties. But he was also a spreader. You know, he helped spread the idea, the gospel of Darwin, if you will. You know, we stand on the shoulders of giants. In the 19th century, just as we were looking at things like seances and this reflexive pushback against the idea that we are part of the material universe, other things were happening in the 19th century that was socially progressive, that were incredibly important, and they were also part of the free thought and what I would consider the humanist movement of today. You know, things like women's suffrage and a woman's right to choose, the vote, education reform. That is, it wasn't just the elites, but the idea of actually having public education was something which we sometimes take for granted now, but these were really progressive things that were happening in the 19th century in England, but also in the United States. Prison reform, you know, not keeping people chained up for whatever they've done that was against the law, but to actually create not just a place to incarcerate people, but to harm people, to bring them back into society. The anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement, the labor and union movement, which came out of course, the massive number of factories that were coming out, the child labor laws that came out. You know, who remembers seeing pictures of like 7-year-olds going down into mines? You know, not getting an education, being replaced if you were an adult and you were hurt, being replaced and not having any type of health care or to get anything for your severance. These were all things that were being reshaped by the Freethought movement and with the Freethought movers of the time. How we cared for the mentally ill. If you look at the asylums of the 19th century, they would scare the crap out of you. There were people chained to walls. There were people who were constantly being beaten. They were treated as if they were not human. And the idea was, no, these people are suffering, and that we have to treat people with human dignity regardless of their mental state. That was starting to really happen in the 19th century. Movements away from church teachings. And we could look at Descartes, and we could look at Hume, and we could look at dozens of other philosophers, but really you're starting to really see a break at this time from the idea of church equals everything. Simply because of not only the mystic movement, which was also another form of denying church truth, but the idea that only the church owns the truth, and only the person who is leading that church owns the truth, was really happening at this time in a very, very big way. We also see the birth of the Freethought movement, changes in economy and philosophy, and also the disposal of religion as the formation for science. That is, you don't need religion to have science. God didn't need to start it all. God didn't have to have a hand in it in order for science to be right, in order for science to be good, in order for us to know. All of these things are happening at the same time that people were also talking about, well, you also don't need the church. That is, the state plays a role in how we care for our elderly, how we care for the sick, how we care for the infirm, how we care for the mentally ill, how we care for our children, how we educate our children. Before this time, the church owned all of that. So the 19th century is at a time where there are these gigantic shifts in the perception of the value of the church as the formation and foundation of society. And so these are the folks who really made the Freethought movement in both the United States and in England so powerful. So powerful that people later on would look to these people who they looked to Darwin for guidance. And it wasn't just people in the Freethought movement. When Darwin published in 1859, everybody had an opinion on natural selection. Nietzsche, Marx, Whitman, great thinkers, great writers, people who are still profoundly with us today in many different ways, were all impacted by what Charles Darwin was writing about the material structure and nature of not just the biological self, but really these laws which are foundational and found within the universe. But these people are really, really important. The first person I think it's important to note is Robert Ingersoll. Do you all know Robert Ingersoll? Most people do. We can thank a lot of that. He sort of fell out of favor. This guy was the rock star of 19th century American Freethought movement. Newspapers would follow him around. If he gave a talk, hundreds of people would be in the room. It was incredible what this guy did. He was incredibly powerful. Not only was he an incredible speaker, but he was an incredible writer as well. So, you know, in the 19th century, there weren't blogs. You know, people didn't have Instagram. You know, all of these things. So the way knowledge was really shared was either through newspapers, thank you very much, okay, or pamphlets. You know, 2 pages, 30 pages, 40 pages, 5-page pamphlets. And then those would get distributed because there wasn't a telephone, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't anything like that. So the way you got the word out was through the written word. The written word is incredibly powerful in the 19th century as it is today. And this guy, Ingersoll, really was, and he fell out of favor. You know, Susan Jacoby wrote this wonderful book on him, calling him the great agnostic. Once you got into the 20th century, however popular this guy was, he was almost forgotten about. That is, if you talk to free thinkers and humanists of the 1950s, you probably wouldn't think of Ingersoll in the same way as we think about him today, because he was just almost like a footnote to history. But he lauded Darwin at every turn. This guy saw what was in Darwin's writing as incredibly important to not only understanding how we should be treating each other, but how the world operates, how the cosmos operates. And I'll just share with you a couple of quotes. And by the way, there are literally hundreds. My research found that this guy talked about Darwin as much as he talked about how there is no God and how the church is really bad. I mean, it was up there. It was in the top 3. Okay? But here are some of the quotes. This century will be called Darwin's century. He was one of the greatest men who ever touched the globe. Darwin has explained more of the phenomena of life than all of the religious teachers. This is in Victorian Infidels. And I won't necessarily read all of them. I know it's very small. The church teaches that man was created perfect and that for 6,000 years he was degenerate. Darwin demonstrated the falsity of this dogma. He shows that man has for thousands of ages steadily advanced, that the Garden of Eden is an ignorant myth, that the doctrine of original sin has no foundation in fact, that the atonement for its absurdity, that the serpent did not tempt, and that man did not fall. So this is a guy who really looked at Darwin's work and said that not only is the Bible a bunch of fiction, but that we should really sort of wake up from the idea that we need, that our morality and our value should come from something like theology. In Ingersoll the Magnificent, Darwin destroyed the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. There is nothing left of faith that we know did not happen. Religion and science are enemies. It's a very interesting position to take. Okay, one is superstition, the other is fact. One rests upon the false, the other upon the true. One is the result of fear and faith, the other the investigation and reason. Dawkins quotes this person. Hitchin quotes this person. But it's not about this person, it's who did this person rely on? And all roads lead back to Darwin to inform his universe. All is true. Theologians know nothing of this world, far less than the next, but they have the power of stating the most absurd positions with faces solemn as stupidity touched by fear. It is part of their business to malign and vilify the Voltaires, the Humes, the Paines, the Humboldts, the Tyndalls, the Haeckels, the Darwins, the Spencers, and the Drapers. Remember we talked about some of these people before. They are the most part engaged in poisoning the minds of the young, prejudicing, wait, why am I not pronouncing that right? Okay, children against science, teaching the astronomy and the geology of the Bible, and including all to desert the sublime standard of reason. So this was a guy who really took no prisoners when he talked. That's what I'm saying. He was, the way T.H. Huxley was to science, he was to the Freethought movement. And both of these people relied very heavily on Darwin. The next is D.M. Bennett. Anyone know who D.M. Bennett is? Okay, so D.M. Bennett was the founder of one of the most important Freethought newspapers in the United States in the 19th century, called the Freethinker. D.M. Bennett actually serialized and published he serialized The Origin of Species in the newspaper. He serialized The Descent of Man when it was published in his newspaper. He was an activist freethinker, and he published a lot of other people and their work as well. In fact, let me see. I thought I had some notes. I'm going to put this down for a second. Excuse me. So while I want this to be like a TED Talk, I'm going to have to rely on some of my notes here. Bennett, like Bradlaugh, who we'll talk about a little later, Bradlaugh started also a Freethought newspaper in the United Kingdom, and they were separated not so much by thought as they were by distance. He published this really important quote. This appeared in the Truthseeker, and it's an excerpt of an interview that a biologist in England, Aveling, had with Charles Darwin, where essentially Darwin, this was towards the end of his life, essentially came out and said, you know, I am with you in thought, but I should prefer to call the word agnostic rather than atheist. I never gave up on Christianity until I was 40 years old. It is not supported by evidence. This is a direct quote from Charles Darwin from the interview with Aveling, who Bennett republished. Bennett, when he died in the same year as Darwin in 1882. And the ranking Truthseeker editor at the time was a man named Eugene MacDonald, wrote this scalding op-ed about how Darwin, after his death, instead of being buried near Down House at his local parish, was buried where, you know where Darwin is? Westminster Abbey. Right? So here's a man who was eviscerated by the English church, but is buried as a favorite son, if you will, of the church. And MacDonald eviscerated that idea because, you know what, they didn't really care about him. They just wanted him there. Sort of like how we do that with China or different objects. They essentially, the church objectified Darwin because they knew what Darwin meant. The Truthseeker, which is still in publication today, by the way. I think it started in 1877. It might have been a little earlier than that. It's still in publication today. During the legacy of this man for the Freethought movement, when the Scopes monkey trial was going on, they were publishing about what was going on in the local towns in Tennessee related to teaching evolution in the public schools. To this day, they still advocate for and accept and quote Darwin in their publication. So this is 130 years of free thinkers relying on Darwin for their sustenance. So two more people. We probably all heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a very famous a woman who fought for the right for women to vote. But you probably don't know Andrew Dickson White. Here are some quotes. This is from The Pleasure of Age. Cady Stanton basically saw in Darwin, as a freethought activist and a fighter for women's rights and women's suffrage, the idea that if we're all in the material universe, just as like we can't disallow people who look different from us to be treated poorly, or that one person has a right to be over another, that women should be equal in terms of their rights and their responsibilities to humanity as well. And so aspects of her activism were profoundly influenced by Charles Darwin as well. One of her quotes in The Pleasures of Age, which I think this is 1877, all things are governed by laws, and laws are immutable in the moral and the material world. We shall find that the keynote of our human relations is love, and the grand chorus is equality. I don't think there's anyone in this room who doesn't feel this today. And she based this on the fact that, well, if we're grounded in the material universe and the material cosmos, as Darwin said we are, then that gives her fodder. She was also a rejectionist of the church. And she said the following. This was published about 2 weeks died. She died in 1902. I think the women received the right to vote in 1920. So she died about 18 years too early. But she said the following. I suggest that inasmuch as the Bible degrades women and in immutable passages teaches her absolute subjugation to man and all his relations, in its present form should be taken from schools and from the rising generation of boys, as it teaches lessons of disrespect for the mothers of the race. Again, she depended on Darwin because what she saw in Darwin was, well, wait a second. Same thing that Annie Besant saw was that, wait a second, if women had the right to choose the timing of their conception, if they wanted to conceive at all, that's a very powerful thing, and that should really lead to equality, not subjugation. Andrew Dickson White is a really interesting guy. He was a religious person and also tried to thread the needle between ethics and morality, respected, believed in Darwin, saw that secularism was incredibly important, saw that the material universe is incredibly important. You know, these were people who are all having these aha moments, those V8 moments, because of natural selection, because of the origin of species and the descent of man. It's like, oh, I can now hang my hat on this. Because even if I do have a faith doctrine that I believe in, I can still accept the world as it is, the material world as it is, the biological world. Andrew Dickson White is interesting for a few reasons. First of all, if you don't know it, he was one of the founders of Cornell University. And he demanded upon Cornell being founded that it be founded as a secular institution. Who went to Cornell University? Carl Sagan, right? Taught there. Neil deGrasse Tyson. Bill Maher. Yeah. Bill Maher didn't graduate, but he went there. I think he just went there to smoke pot and get laid, probably. You're not recording this, are you? But this is the importance of someone like, and the other thing that what White did was he was one of these bon vivants, sort of like Franklin. He sat in a lot of different ponds, and he was very respected in his day as a free thinker, as an honest man. He was a diplomat, and during the Civil War, he went to the highest government aspects of reaches of government in both England and in France, and implored them not to support the South during the Civil War, to essentially rob the South of its oxygen, of money, supplies, things like that, that they couldn't produce themselves. And he got them to agree. So that helped them North to not only win the Civil War, because the South really didn't have any allies outside of the states that they were a part of, but it also meant, as an abolitionist, he was for the rights of people who were treated so badly as under slavery. So these are some of the Americans, and there were many, many others, but these are some of the Americans that you should really know about, because if you're a humanist or an atheist or a free thinker, whether you know it or not, you are connected to these people. And whether you know it or not, or now you do, that these people are connected to Darwin. So when we say that Darwin is the apical ancestor, it's not meant as just a tagline. It's meant that, yeah, a lot of these roads seem to come back to the understanding of our human place in nature, thanks to Darwin and Wallace as well. We can't forget Alfred Russel Wallace in this mix. Charles Bradlaugh is really a fascinating person. He was British, and he, along with Annie Besant, were really firebrands for the Freethought movement in England. Bradlaugh was also a publisher, like we saw with Bennett, and a couple of things. He and Annie Besant were really connected for women's rights movements, the rights to reproductive freedom. Bradlaugh was elected to Parliament, but he refused. This is interesting. He refused to take his oath on a Bible, and so Parliament, the government, refused to seat him in Parliament. But that didn't stop him, because he would go out and he would vote as an MP anyway, even though he was technically an unseated member of Parliament, because he wouldn't take the oath on a Bible. So much so that he was fined and imprisoned for it, but still refused to take an oath which he did not believe in. And we just have someone who took their oath on a law book. That was an internet meme not that long ago. You saw Mike Pence with that member of Congress who took their oath on a law book rather than a Bible. And here are some quotes from Bradlaugh that he either, because he was a newspaper man, and the two things that newspaper men did was, just like with Bennett, was that they would publish newspapers, but they were also in the publishing business, so they would publish all these other pamphlets as well. So This is something that he published by an author by the last name of Cockbill. Darwin's anticipation of the judgment passed upon his views has been more than realized. The great objection to his view is commonly expressed in the words, what it leads to. There can be no doubt that it leads to the assumption of natural instead of supernatural causes. Those who do not wish to relinquish their notion of the supernatural, producing, sustaining, and guiding the natural, have better leave Darwin alone. Now, these are not necessarily Bradlaugh's words, but these were the things that Bradlaugh was publishing in the 19th century related to Darwin and related to the Freethought movement. Here's another one for you. This is from the atheistic platform. I told you from the outset that I come to these conclusions by way of science. From science, especially your Darwinian science, you can learn so much more. You are the students of Darwin. You have learned something of his views, and this is great, and his great truths. You will know what I mean by this idea of changing the environment, the surroundings, as well as changing the individual. This is from the atheistic platform. Another one, this is a reprint of Garrison's Absence of Design in Nature. Garrison was, I believe, a physician. The doctrine of evolution, natural selection, and the survival of the fittest explains all of the most satisfactory manner. Evolution is, therefore, the designing hand. Those who refuse to accept the doctrine of evolution because of all the steps and stages in the evolution of animals and the plants not observed are rejecting evidence of an army of witnesses. So again, Bradlaugh is publishing all of these things to really edge the conversation for those who are willing to listen. And he had a very large readership, and he was a massive leader in the 19th century in England related to the Freethought movement. I'll leave you with one more. This is also from Aveling. Just like the uproar of once Darwin was interred in Westminster Abbey, Aveling, who, if you remember earlier, had actually interviewed Darwin before his death, wrote the following in Bradlaugh's newspaper regarding the church. They slandered him when he was living, not without protest from us. And now that he is dead, and even evil is spoken of him, our voices must be raised. If owning his resting place meant that the church could own his history and his memory as well, something freethinkers at the time and now rightfully challenge. So again, the idea of owning Charles Darwin's memory, his physical resting place, meant that, again, a favorite son was the perfect way of saying it, when the reality is that he was treated horribly by the church. And there were people, in fact, at one point during Darwin's life, there was because of his writings, which became incredibly popular and incredibly important, they were going to offer him a knighthood, and it was shot down by the church. So, they really didn't want to give Darwin his due. Of course, ultimately, Darwin winds up on the 10-pound note. Have anyone been to Britain and seen that? Okay, so, you come around eventually, okay, but the time is very, very painful. Annie Besant was very interesting. She eventually left the Freethought movement and became a mystic. She sort of went the other way. The clock sort of wound back for her. But she was very important because she, aside from working with Bradlaugh in so many different ways, she used Darwin in her ideas related to when a woman should have birth. She wasn't necessarily involved in the movement for women's suffrage related to voting rights, but definitely for women owning their bodies. And that made her an incredibly important, and to this day, an incredibly important person, because she said that as biological beings, and Darwin had proved this. In fact, she published in 1870 a lot of stuff got published in 1877. In 1877, she published The Law of Population, The Consequences and Its Bearing on Human Conduct and Morals. She quotes Darwin 5 times in this pamphlet that's only 47 pages, which basically said, look, women own the right to their bodies. From an evolutionary point of view, we are the ones who are responsible for not only the birth of humanity, but when we choose to give birth, if we choose to give birth at all. Darwin has proved that. And no theology can teach us differently. And no point of view or biased point of view has a right to inflict upon a woman the right to choose the timing of her pregnancy. That's the other thing about both Bradlaugh and Besant in, I can't remember what year it is, they both were put on trial for publishing an American doctor's pamphlet from 1837, which essentially gave, in its pages, essentially explained to married couples how to avoid pregnancy. So Bradlaugh and Besant, because they were both in the media and newspapers, republished this 1837, slightly updated it for 60 years later, or 30 years later, but it was essentially the same thing about how to avoid getting pregnant. And, the morals police, came down on them really, really hard. They put them on trial for sin, for being sinners, right? For blasphemy. And they essentially both ignored because they were also told to stop publishing this one particular publication. And what did they do? Over 125,000 copies of this book made it into the hands of the common British people. So this is what Besant was really about before her turn to Blavatsky's mysticism and almost the equivalent of Scientology today. And one of her quotes, which is, I just really have one here, this is from The Law of Population. Darwin, in his Origin of Species, said there is no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increases as to high a rate that, if not destroyed, the earth would soon be covered by a progeny of a single pair. Basically meaning that if women did not, if birth control was not used, that we would have overpopulation and that would be horrible. And therefore giving women the right to choose the timing or if they want to get pregnant was one of the highest things that we could do, is to recognize amongst our common humanity. Then we go to George Foote. George Foote lived into the early 20th century. He was a protege of Bradlaugh. He's published a few things. He was clearly influenced by both Bradlaugh and by Darwin, to the point where he sort of checkered over Bradlaugh and always went to Darwin as the source material. Source material. Again, the Brooklyn, you can take the boy out of Brooklyn, but you can't get the Brooklyn out of the boy. Ph.D. or not, bathroom. Yeah. 3rd Avenue and 33rd Street. Sorry. You'll cut that out of that, won't you? Okay, right, exactly. Okay, so in certain cases, Foote wrote about the importance of Darwin and Newton. And while he respected both of them, he sort of thought that Darwin really had more to say about how we actually operate in the world, because if you look at Newton's work, it is so mathematically based that you can't understand it. But one of the things about Origin of Species and all of Darwin's later writing is that you can actually understand what he's saying. And what Foote wrote was that in a certain sense, Darwin's achievements are more remarkable because they profoundly affect our notions of man's position in the destiny of the universe, and that they could be understood it that way much simpler or much easier than, let's say, Newton. Not that, to throw any shade on Newton, but he was really, Foote was really a big fan of Darwin. He also wrote, Foote was also imprisoned for publishing Freethought publications. He was censored by the government. Unlike Bradlaugh, who was sort of this bon vivant and sort of didn't really, sorry, it's an Italian hairdresser from Brooklyn, sort of threw his thumb up at the establishment and got away with it, Foote didn't. Foote spent years in British penitentiaries doing hard labor for his freethought beliefs and publications. That I wouldn't necessarily call him a martyr, but he sure as heck almost became one, because the censorship was so oppressive. And so you have this thread running through even to today's world, where the idea of being a freethinker or an atheist or an agnostic or a humanist is sort of a bad word for some people, to this day, or this idea of trying to get away from teaching the material universe and Darwin and all these other things that we know is true based on science rather than opinion or theology or non-fact. But he writes about how in his trial, he writes about Huxley and Tyndale and Spencer, and that how they may appear ridiculous, but the ridiculousness was on the fault of the law and not the men, meaning that the laws at the time allowed for the censorship of free thought and free thinkers. So they were unjust laws. And he used this as part of his defense, which didn't work, sadly. He also wrote, "The philosophy of evolution took possession of his mind and gradually expelled belief in God and the belief in immortality." That is, Foote writing about what eventually happened to Darwin in Darwin's own evolution related to his later ideas of humans' place in nature. And finally, my object is to show the general reader that where Darwin's views on religion and as far as possible face the growth of those views of his time, I desire to point out in particular that he thought the lead ideas of theology were affected by the doctrine of evolution. Further, I wish to prove that there is no essential difference between agnosticism and what has always been thought of as atheism. So even though Darwin was a self-admitted agnostic, again, being very, very cautious because he was so afraid to upset people, his own wife, Darwin's own wife, was a deeply religious woman. To upset the social order of which he was in. But what Foote was saying in Darwin on God was that Darwin was an atheist. He didn't want to call himself that because he didn't want to upset anybody. So he said, well, let me go for that, when you bring the, to me, agnosticism is bringing the ball, since it's Super Bowl Sunday, to the 1 yard line instead of getting the goal. If you're going to say you're agnostic, you're at the 1 yard line. But I understand the cautiousness of that and the idea of why people would say that if they truly believe that, well, there's more to the universe than we might even know, and therefore we have to at least leave some mystery to it in the sense that until something is proved beyond the shadow of a doubt, I will be an agnostic. And that's fine if that's what people want to believe. As an anthropologist, I accept that. As a free thinker and as a humanist, as an atheist myself, I think that I would not go down that cautious road. I'll score the goal. Lastly, I leave you with Chapman Kohn. He lived into the mid-1950s, and like George Foote before him, he became the head of the British Secular Society. He also became the chief editor of the Freethinker. I'll just leave you. This is Kohn, Evolution and Christianity. But it was God's and this was a way to show that, how could there be a loving God, right, when there's all this pain in the world, and that how we can have all this pain in the world, or children are born deformed, and so on and so forth. But if it was God's purpose that only the fit should survive, why create the unfit? If the wisdom of God is to show in the structure of the animals that survive must there not be a sad lack of wisdom in the immense number that succumb? That's a very 19th century way of saying that God is a son of a bitch if he exists. Very flowery writing. And then he also wrote this: the object of this present essay on evolutionary ethics, because he said, a lot of the ethicists thought that Darwin's work was unethical. Even Nietzsche thought it was missing some things related to ethics. Marx thought that Marx, by the way, wanted to actually dedicate. Was it Das Kapital or one of his later books to Darwin, by the way. He was a big fan, but had some issues with natural selection. Felt that it didn't work in the material universe. That there was this big push in the 19th century to say, well, does evolution by natural selection make us more or less ethical beings? That is, are we just animals, and therefore none of these things matter in terms of, are they so subjective? Versus, have we developed, because we are this species, an ability for ethics? And so Darwin Kohn writes about evolutionary ethics. The object of the present day, disclosed by the title, is presenting a few words as possible, an outline of a system of ethics based on the doctrine of evolution. That is, that we have devised and revised our social behavior and our social normative behavior to allow both for biological evolution, but also for free thought and humanistic cultural evolution as well. Now, Darwin probably has something to say about this because, the whole idea of survival of the fittest, a term that was not coined by Darwin, is the idea, and it's sort of taking Darwin's name in vain by saying that we can allay the biological process of natural selection on society. Well, that's used an awful lot if you want to oppress people, because even early anthropology, and I'm an anthropologist, I have to say, if you look at how things were written in the 18th and 19th century, you're talking about savagery and barbarism. Well, guess who's not savagery and barbaristic? White guys. Everybody else is, because you're not who I am. But that's a misuse, because Darwin never talked about natural selection as being suitable for understanding culture. It is purely foundational part of biology. Okay, so why does all this matter? Why should we need to remember? Why is any of this important? Why should we give, the back end of Puxatawny Phil as to why it's important to remember where we came from, if we're free thinkers now, if we're humanists now? Because I say to you that the battle isn't over. That understanding Darwin and appreciating his work is something that we have to pass on to the next generation, and the next, and the next. It's an uphill battle because the United States is sitting around here next to Turkey, which, by the way, has just taken evolution out of its textbooks. Okay? Did we come from an earlier species? And you can see where the United States, right, the largest military industrial complex nation on the, a quote-unquote secular democracy, right? That's why I use quote-unquote, is next to Turkey in terms of the acceptance of evolution, somewhere around the 40% range. There's something wrong with that picture. That's why it matters. We can look at things like PISA averages. The United States always touts its literacy rate. And if you look at the literacy rates, if you're an educator, you say, oh, we're 7th in the world in literacy. Okay? But literacy means nothing if you don't have comprehension. I can understand what those squiggly lines on the wall might represent, but if I don't know how to interpret them use them, make new knowledge from them, understand them, then it makes no difference. I can understand that a 2 equals a representation of a 2. And you can see where the United States is in terms of mathematics, somewhere around 36th. You can see where we are in terms of reading comprehension, not literacy, but comprehension. Where we are in terms of science comprehension. And you realize that the work that we've failed in some ways. You failed, I've failed, our politicians have failed to be able to make people better equipped to understand the nature of nature. And that's something that we all have to continue to do. Because there are people out there, right? All right, the Ken Hams, who wrote Left Behind, the Left Behind series? The guy who said that the banana evolved so we can hold it in our hand, whatever his name is. I can't remember his name. There are people out there who will be greedy and try to own the next generation with the silliness of past generations, right? They'll invest millions of dollars in showing dinosaurs with humans. Building an ark park, which the Bible says, Noah was able to do with just a couple of people in a very short amount of time, didn't need to use like trucks and, 5 years, several, $80 billion and so on and so forth, right? Because really what you're looking at here is the Flintstones, okay? If you accept Ken Ham's evangelical view of the nature of nature, which is a view that denies Darwin, you're really talking no better than... Now, I love the Flintstones, okay? But I see it as a comedy. I see it as a cartoon. This is cartoon science, if it's science at all, okay? And this is one of my favorite things. Oh, crap, is that today? Because how these people show, well, the dinosaurs were part of the flood too, blah, blah, blah. Forget about the KT boundary, the fact that we actually know that an asteroid hit the Earth 65 million years ago, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of intellectual, if you want to call it that, and emotional and political and economic energy that fuels the disinformation campaign that is foundational to Darwin and Wallace's work. And so it's incumbent on each of us, whether you're a teacher or factory worker or you park cars for a living, make pizzas, astrophysicist, whatever you are, understand that the danger to this is it affects not only our understanding of science, but it undermines secular society as well. Because once you start, having the idea that God did all this stuff, and this is the way I interpret the Bible, and all these other things, that not only does science go out of the way, but so does freedom. So does a woman's right to choose. So does who gets to be, live where people want to live, so on and so forth. So those are the dangers. And if you know these two guys in particular, you know that they are Pennsylvania, okay, with the No Child Left Behind legislation. You know what he tried to do? Slip into that? What? An intelligent design writer to the legislation. It never made it in, but he did it. He tried to do it at least. Okay, and this guy, the very pale Michael Scott, as I like to call him. If you're a fan of The Office, basically in Congress, when he was in Congress, gave this whole speech, and it's in the congressional record, about how intelligent design will eventually win out. That there's no debate in his mind that we are divinely created. Okay, so. He's standing in line, by the way. I know that, regardless of how you feel about Trump and what may or may not happen to Trump in the next year or two, okay, if for any reason Trump should exit the political stage, that's who we have to contend with. An evangelical who won't shake a woman's hand, right? Who doesn't believe that a woman has a right to choose. You know, all the things that Cady, Stanton, and all these other people, these free thinkers are working on, and is an evolution denier on religious grounds. And so, I guess in summary, I think what's important to understand, and I think what these free thinkers thought about Darwin's work is the things that we should take joy in knowing now. I think Darwin is a form of liberation. Understanding natural selection and understanding science is a form of free thought liberation. It leads us to be able to be more open. We don't have to build walls. I won't get political, although I almost did there. Okay, but it leads to certain joys and understanding that our time here is so precious. And I think that's what all these other free thinkers were thinking of too. That if we really are part of the material universe, biological beings, and people who, a group of species that is here for a limited amount of time, that we should really be finding the joy and not the fear in life, because our time on this stage is so small, is so short. And I think you find this as part of the free thought and the humanistic credo, that because of evolution, we are one human family. No one is better than the other, economically, physically, so on and so forth. That is the evolution, that is the liberation of natural selection, is essentially understanding this. That we are all part of the same big story. That is, because we all evolved, and that we are all products of natural selection, that not only is our biological sense important to understand, but going back to what Carl Sagan said about have evolved so the universe could know itself, is that we are all part of this bigger picture than even our own time on this planet. That we can understand that 14.8 billion years ago, something happened which created all of the material cosmos that we're in. And whether you're a fan of string theory or other theories or whatever, that there might be more stuff, multiverses, right? That all of these things are not uncommon. That is, the creation of cosmoses is something that happens more frequently than our science can even reveal to us. And that also means, and it's different from what a religion says, is that we might be special, but not in the way that religion wants us to think of ourselves as special. Not as having dominion over the planet. But we are special in the sense that it's so rare and unlikely that our species would evolve in a cosmos this large, and that other cosmoses or other universes will look radically different, but we're all part of the same fundamental concepts and laws, of which natural selection appears to be one of them. All of the variation that we see is part of our survival. That is, the last thing you want is for everyone to look like me. Exactly. Trust me. Both of my ex-wives say the same thing. That is the reason why there's all this human variation, is because we are the benefactors of our families and their experiences in different geographies. That is, when you have species that only have a few genes to allow X, Y, and Z to exist in a certain geography or geology, if the environment changes in some radical way, that might lead to the extinction of that species. But with all of the human variation we have in terms of height, hair color, texture, skin color, all those things, all that variation is a plus and not a negative. Well, we talked about this already in that tree, that basically we've been able to unlock so many other scientific disciplines because we accept, as the Brinski said, the logic of natural selection. We've enlivened our self-awareness of the material world. And finally, and I think this is important if you're a free thinker, if you're an agnostic or an atheist, that even if you believe in a higher being, you may not accept theology. The idea that we can liberate ourselves from the deceptions and the inadequacies of theology. That knowing the cosmos trumps, pardon the expression again, the idea that, that there is not a rational, natural consequence to the shape and the amount and existence itself. So, I thank you. These are my 2 books. You don't have to, oh, you can applaud. Thank you very much. Neither of them are on sale today, so hold on to your wallet. I don't have any copies of God's Grace with me, and the Darwin's Apostle doesn't come out until April. But since this is Darwin Month rather than Darwin Day, I had to thank Jason and all of you all for having me out. And so I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Let's hear it again. At this time, we'll take questions and answers. So who has a question first?
Well, I'll take questions. I don't know if you'll have answers. Yes.
We'll take your answer.
All right. What's the old joke of what Groucho Marx said? It's $5 for me to sing and $10 for me not to sing. So it's $5. No, go ahead.
There was a lot of information relative to European thought.
Right.
Has Darwin affected the Far East, India and China?
Yes, I would say that there, if you look at the philosophies of Buddhism and Confucianism, which are religions or philosophies, is that you see the understanding of a material universe which was very different from Judeo-Christianity. Even in the 5th century in the Islamic world, you had a philosopher scientist who was Muslim essentially come up with natural selection 700 years before the origin of species. So the groundwork for understanding nature has been there for all this time. I always like to talk about the idea of the difference, and I do this in my classes all the time, the idea of discovery versus uncovery. And it might seem very subtle, but when we say that Darwin discovered natural selection, he didn't necessarily discover it because it was happening all the time. What he did really was uncover it. And so there's a subtle difference there, but it basically means that he didn't, invent something. He just figured out a way to talk about it in a way that popularized it in the West. But you had the antecedents of understanding the material world, the natural world, right or wrong from a theological point of view to a non-theological point of view in many different ways. And there were scholars in the 19th century outside of Europe, especially in Asia and in parts of the Middle East and the Far East, who did see Darwin's work as really important for their own liberation. I think even Gandhi talked about Darwin as being important for liberation from the British. Again, for the same reason. If we are all equals under nature, you have no right to make my people destitute, quote unquote, my people. So yeah, it didn't just affect the West. It didn't just affect America. This was a revolution, if you will, of liberation that went across a lot of the English speaking, even if English wasn't your first language, because Darwin's work was then interpreted and written in native languages across whole other continents. So his work did impact others. Yes.
All right, who else? Come back here.
Yeah, I took a trip in January. I drove down to Florida, and just to get warm, get out of this mess.
Did you bring any of it back?
Well, I came back, and it was snowing when I came back on Tuesday, which is not good. But while I was down there, I've been known to wear some shirts that kind of inflame some people. I have my friendly atheist shirt that I didn't take that with me. But I did bring my Freethinker sweatshirt from the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and I got a lot of comments on that.
Uh-oh.
Mostly positive.
Bravo.
And that was maybe a few years ago. That wouldn't have happened. And I was in, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and it's just interesting what people think. When you get into a conversation with them. So,
Sure.
And it's not a dangerous situation at all. At least I didn't see any of it. It was very interesting. Oh, and the other thing is that you talked about Bennett. While you're talking there, I'm also reading on my iPad.
Oh, good.
And I noticed that Bennett put out actually proffered a pamphlet called Cupid's Yokes, which was a kind of a strange, it's about sex, and it came out at a time when nobody really wanted to hear about sex. And one of the conclusions at the end of that was that eventually all churches will disappear, and we won't have to worry about that anymore. Nobody quite liked him for doing that, so they put him in prison in Albany for 13 months. I thought, well, maybe a Freethinker sweatshirt was not such a good idea.
Well, yeah, we have to harken back to an understanding that, at least at this point in our social evolution, we can be part of the larger conversation, and we can wear our shirts, and we can write, and I can be up here talking with you, and we can have these conversations without fear of imprisonment. But there are a lot of countries where journalists are being murdered for their free thought. Working for the I wrote the policy paper for the AHA, which was read and accepted by the International Humanist and Ethical Union about what happened to the Bangladeshi bloggers who were all systematically murdered for their free thought ideas. It's still dangerous to be, I think, a free thinker, an atheist in this country, but less so. Certainly on the Northeast, it's a lot easier if you are in, let's say, Louisiana, which is one of the reasons why I think it's really important, as I like to say, to give these talks in New York. But, in some places they're throwing, rocks at atheists. In New York, you can't throw a rock without hitting an atheist. And so it's important for, let's say, the national organizations to really, hold their conferences in places that aren't New York and San Francisco. To do it in Louisiana or Georgia or all these other places, because, did anyone go to any of the Reason rallies? Those were brilliant and they were wonderful, and I can't tell you how many people I met who were like, oh, thank goodness I can come out of the closet. Even Barney Frank. You remember Barney Frank? It was easier for him as a congressman to come out gay than it was for him to come out an atheist. And I've talked with Barney a lot of times, and he says, well, it was just the times that I was in. So think about it, where it's easier for a politician, and again, our times change and they don't stay exactly the same, and certainly being able, standing in front of Mike Pence and taking the oath of office on a law book is certainly progress, okay? But the idea that in certain places, in certain quarters of this country, you can't really, even if you come out, you can't be effervescent about it, about your non-belief or your questioning or your cynicism, not cynicism, but skepticism, is really something that we have to be very, very mindful of. Because people do get trapped in situations where they really cannot be as free with their ideas or their gatherings. Then it's changing a lot, and I think it's changing for the better. Now more, if you look at the number of people, the number of nuns, not NUNS, but NONES, if you study the demographics, that generation, there are more people who are nuns who are in their 20s than ever before. Like in terms of the college population, 3/4 of the college population might be spiritual, but they have no theology. So that says a lot about what's happening. There are more people in this country as a voting group. Now, I'm not saying we should be monolithic in our voting, but if you look at the raw numbers, there are more people who are non-believers in this country than there are evangelicals. However, evangelicals seem to have the stranglehold on the politics of the moment, and that's something that was deliberate, that started all the way back in the 1960s. That plan, that diabolical plan, if you will.
Next one for questions.
So do you have some optimism for us? Do you see
Yes.
the next generation being a little different? Do you think, because I kind of look at this, what's the long range plan? Like,
Sure.
what are we, the church has all these wonderful buildings and the songs and the
And they got the wonderful
Yeah.
buildings, but nobody's in them.
tourists mostly.
Yeah, tourists, exactly. Like if you go to Europe, they're basically museums now. In the United States, you find that most of the dioceses are selling the property, the churches, and they're combining dioceses because they don't have enough people going into the priesthood or the nunnery, and the number of people who are actually spiritual and not religious are saying that you don't need to do this in a place like church, or they've just given up in the sense, or never had a belief in a monotheistic belief or polytheistic belief. And this is not just me as a quote-unquote hopeful atheist saying this. If you look at the church's own statistics, which I do as a researcher, you see that they've been both the evangelical and the Roman Catholic Church have been saying for a decade now, we are on a course that ultimately leads to our extinction because nobody's going to church anymore. I mean, you do have people still going, but the numbers are just, 8%. And who's in the pews? Not the families. Older people.
Yeah, but then
Yeah.
you have these mega churches too. They're not, the big,
Absolutely,
yeah.
and the impression that the whole world is a megachurch, but you're talking about maybe in a nation of 365 million people. We were talking about maybe 30 million people, and that they are effervescent in their belief, and yes. The church does give them a strong foundation, okay, in terms of culture. And if you're an anthropologist, you love studying things like that. But if I take my anthropological hat off and my humanist atheist hat and researcher hat on, I see that is, believe it or not, for however huge that looks, it's an outlier. So am I optimistic? I can't help but not be. But not because I see things through rose-colored glasses. I actually track the demographics. I think one of the reasons why you're seeing this backlash to globalism, this idea of building the wall and keeping the brown people out, is a reaction to the liberalization that has gone on for at least 80 years, but that this is, and this is one of my hopes, of course, and I think you saw it in what happened in the last congressional repudiation of that, is that what we will see is that, since at least the year 2000 or before, demographers have been saying that by 2050, this is not going to be a white Anglo-Saxon country. That's just a fact. That's just the way it is. So I think what you're seeing is fear. And I understand fear is a motivator and is a motivating factor. You combine that with the religion, that becomes even more powerful, brighter. And you combine that with a political climate that allows for fear and xenophobia based on the color of people's skin being in charge, like having 3 houses of Congress and giving a pass and getting rid of the rule of law, that's very problematical. But I think what you're seeing now is that you'll see a backlash to the backlash. And that what you'll see in the 2020 race and hopefully going further is a move away from this. perhaps your nieces and nephews, your grandchildren, or whatever, will look back on you at this time in their history books and say, what was it like under Trump? And then, oh boy, do you have,
story for you.
yeah, do we have a story for you? Because their reality is going to be very different than our reality is, just like our reality now is different from our parents' reality. And my assumption is, based on the data, is that if we are more politically astute, now we're leaving the area of anthropology, we're going to political science, if we're more politically astute and we require amongst our political leaders the true values of constitutional secular democracy to flourish, then that in itself is antithetical to theocracy and the Trump administration.
As an anthropologist, could
Yeah.
you describe for us what a televangelist atheist might look like?
Yeah, there's a really good one. He wrote a book, and he's actually a friend of mine, and his name escapes me. He's part of the Clergy Project. Jerry DeWitt. I don't know if you know him or not, but he was an evangelical pastor. He's a buddy of mine. I interviewed him for my other book, and we've been close friends for almost a decade. And he comes out of the Deep South, where he was for years and years and years and years. Can I get an amen? Really, the huckster up there and doing all that stuff. But like with fossilization, there's a slow accretion of, wait a second, this isn't making sense. There's an accretion of reason over faith and so on and so forth. And so now he is an evangelical atheist. And he's wonderful, and he lost everything because of it. And, some of the things he told me were really interesting is that, the Clergy Project, former clergy who, have come out as atheists after leading a flock. Another good friend of mine is David Madison, who was an Episcopalian. They said the same thing, that there are a lot of people who are non-believers but a member of the clergy, and sometimes they do it because of humanistic reasons. Because in some places, the church is the only place where a woman who's getting beaten by her husband can go to seek solace and services. And so if the preacher or a priest leaves, that person will have nowhere to go. And so they stay, not because they believe in the theology anymore, but because they want to help the people who are in their community. So that's something you should understand, is that the AA meetings, which oftentimes happen in churches, or all these other social services, feeding the poor, the hungry, which are all really good and humanistic things to do, sometimes happen under people who might wear a collar or be part of wear the garb or have the title, but they've given up their faith, but they still want to make a difference and make the world a better place. Yes.
So you did an excellent job.
For the sake of the audio, we just need to end the microphone.
I think you did an excellent job of showing basically how we got to where we are here.
Oh, thank you.
But my mind is asking,
Okay.
where are we supposed to go next?
Right. Okay.
And it's very challenging future, I believe. Maybe you could clarify that. I know that my becoming a non-believer took years.
Okay.
And it was painful for part of it, And like if I see, I would like when my father was dying, I didn't even want to tell him what I thought.
Right.
Because I thought it would be upsetting. And,
Sure.
And I thought, that would be really selfish of me to talk about this.
But isn't that humanistic, to not want to hurt another person?
Yes.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting at
Yeah.
is changing someone's mind is not a debate doesn't do it.
Right.
It takes their own initiative.
Absolutely. There was a study recently done amongst religious people which said if there was verifiable proof that there is no God, would you stop believing in God? And most of those people said that they would still believe in God. Okay, so being part of the conversation is incredibly important. Understanding that, people's culture identity is mixed with the idea of what they have been taught. When I do talks like this, not amongst other freethinkers, but in churches and things like that, I always do start off with saying, I'm not here for anyone to think like me. I'm here to be able to share an equal form of wisdom, which I hope that you'll understand comes from a position of love, for love of humanity, just the way your Bible may tell you to love humanity. And so the goal here is not to make anyone feel bad about their beliefs, but it's about planting seeds. Right? The danger is and one of the things that theology is so against when it comes to Darwin, when it comes to free thinking, is the idea of the loss of that next generation. I think that we all have a responsibility to be part of that conversation, and my guess is that everybody here is. And that doesn't mean that you have to be violent, but it does mean that you have to be honest. And I've never taken up, I've never taken up a sword to kill someone for believing in God, the way people who believe in God will kill an atheist, okay? But I will challenge their ideas. And I think, again, if you go harken back to what I was saying earlier about the demographics of all of this change that you're seeing, is that the generations that are coming, is that it actually is easier for us than it may seem, because we see televangelists and we see them owning the White House and all of this insanity going on. That the younger people, the next generation and the next generation, they're not like their parents at all. If 75% of the people in college now don't ascribe to a particular faith tradition, I think that says an awful lot about where this country is going. Okay, go ahead.
Let's take one more question on the microphone here, and then you're able to hang around a little bit if there's more
Yeah,
conversation.
sure.
So if you want to continue the conversation, hang around.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you can give some introspection to the other side. So if, things are changing, you either double down and you burn your fire twice as bright, or maybe the Catholic Church and you admit we've done something wrong and we have to take our lumps.
We apologize to Galileo finally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Or
Sorry, Galileo.
Or do you look for a newer flock like South America because our plans aren't working here? What does a conversation look like that from the other organization's side?
I think that's a really good point, because if you look about who is leading congregations, they're not the Irish anymore. They're the Filipino. They are the African. They are from Latin America. They're not the group from the 19th century anymore, because the Catholic Church in particular has had to expand their farm team, and so because they've already lost Europe. They've lost much of the United States, and so they have to go to other places where there's still social economic issues. And again, this whole idea of, in the 19th century, finally rejecting the idea that the church is the most important place and that everything has to spring from it, okay? Where the church still has that magic, if you will, to make people believe that is the case. And so that's where they're getting the priests now, which is interesting, because most of the people who are going to churches are probably all in favor of building walls. Maybe not, I shouldn't say that. But they're seeing the people who are leading the congregation who don't look like them, because all of that generation has died out. So more to your point, the other side is, power does not give itself up willingly, right? Authority does not give itself up willingly. it's a slow accretion, just like with fossilization, just like with everything, just like our time is very different from our parents' time. And so I think you will see in the next 10, certainly next 3 years, but certainly 5 years, 7, 10 years out, is that we're going to snap back to that, and that those people will still be part of the conversation, and people who are of faith and are willing to be partners with seculars, open the doors to your heart and to your home to them, because we are all part of the same human family. But you don't have to submerge your views and your values for the sake of somebody's theological values. And that's what I tell my children, who are atheists, and they're, they're the 20-somethings. They are, graduate school and law school, and they're atheists because they had an atheist father. And they saw the corruption, and they saw what they didn't like when they were forced to go to temple, and how archaic it all was, And I think that's the thing. The drama is being played out as much in our politics as it is being played out in our homes. But that's where I think we have to be both the arbiters as well as the leaders for the next generation, and to do it with joy. There isn't a day that goes by where I don't find the joy in things, even when the day is horrible. Because you know what? What else? What choice do we have? Do we give up? Do we lay down our arms and say, put up a white flag and say, no, we're done? No, we have to come back with the same grace and joy as if we had already won the race. But make no mistake, this is still a quote-unquote war of ideas, okay? But it's not one that we have to be violent over, but it's one that we have to be astute, and it's one that we have to carry the flag forward in. So. Thank you.
Let's hear it again for our speaker coming all the way from New York. Thank you so much, and if you'd like to hang around to continue the conversation, feel free to do so.